So we're going to start with a prayer and reflection. In the name of the Father and Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious God, provide us with a listening heart so we may see and hear the voice of children and adults at risk. May our organisations, authorities and families listen to, respect and do what is required to keep children and adults at risk safe. We ask you to help each of us to exercise our duties with compassion, integrity and clarity as we work together to enact real change and uphold the safety of all who come in contact with our church and communities. Amen.
Amen.
So I recognise that I'm facilitating this session from the Boorloo country, located on the traditional land of the Whadjuk people and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all joining from today. We honour the First Nations peoples, culture and connection to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. ACSL acknowledges the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families, the failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk, and the consequent breaches of community trust. And please be aware that this session discusses abuse and therefore may contain content that you find confronting. If you start to feel distressed, please use your own judgment and ensure you are safe. You can find support resources on the ACSL website. So today I am pleased to introduce our presenter of Dr. Ursula Stephens, ACSL CEO. Dr. Stephens was appointed CEO of ACSL in 2021. Prior to this, Ursula served as CEO of Catholic Social Services Australia, and her role with Catholic Social Services saw her speaking on behalf of vulnerable and marginalised people, as well as the hundreds of Catholic social service sites across the country that support them. Ursula has extensive experience and strong commitment to community service and social justice. She has much experience in advocacy, policy development and relationship building, alongside the knowledge she's gained through working with numerous Catholic organisations to lead ACSL in its national safeguarding role. A former Australian politician, Ursula also served as Senator for New South Wales from 2002 to 2014, representing the Australian Labor Party. She was Parliamentary Secretary to Prime Ministers Rudd and Gillard from 2007 to 2010. Now, I've done the introduction, but I all know that you know Ursula, and she probably needs no introduction. However, today, Ursula will be presenting an overview of the direction of safeguarding initiatives, as indicated in the second Pontifical Commission Annual Report and the proposed Universal Guidelines Framework. As I said, Ursula will be doing most of the talking for the first part of today. We want to hear from you in the second part. So if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to the chat throughout the session. I'll collate them and I'll present them, or you can present them to Ursula after she's finished her slides. All that being said, welcome, Ursula. There's so much in there, but it's really nice. I will start by ensuring that I pin you and that we can see you. There we go. And I will start I've lost my words, haven't I? Of course I have. I will start by sharing the PowerPoint presentation. That's what I need to do. Sorry, 2 seconds, everyone. There we go. Sorry, there you go. Hopefully that's working now. Ursula?
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Kendra. Okay, can everybody see me now, Kendra? No, I've lost you. I can't hear you.
That's okay. That's because I muted myself.
Okay. Paul says yes. Yes.
Paul says
Jane
yes.
says yes. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, everyone. We've just a bit of a dry run here with technology. We've all forgotten what we needed to do from 2025, but we're back online again now. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm on the land of the Gundungurra people here in Canberra and pay my respects to elders past and present here in this part of the country, and welcome you all today to our first webinar for 2026. So today I've been asked to talk about safeguarding directions, where we're heading and what it means for you. And I think there's an old Irish saying that says, if you were going to go to there, then you wouldn't be starting from here. So I'm just taking the liberty, first of all, to have a quick potted history of the abuse crisis within the church and just remind people of where that's all happening, where that's been and where the church itself has moved. And then what I'd like to do is consider what's happened since the Australian Royal Commission, which commenced in 2013 and brought down its report in 2017, thinking about both the church's response and the wider community and government response. And from there, let's consider where we are right now at this juncture, almost 10 years on from the report. And finally, then we consider what the future of safeguarding is for all of us and what our responsibilities are. So I hope in doing that, I cover off what people are expecting me to talk about today, and we get to the point of questions. So, yes.
Sorry, Ursula, I'm going to interrupt for 2 seconds and get the screen sharing working, because right now I got a message saying that they can see me and the PowerPoint, not you. So I just want to get that fixed. And my apologies, everyone. I have a new computer that I'm trying to set this up, and so it's just trying to figure out what's happened. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing to start with.
Yep.
And then tells me.
Okay, it's really okay. The slides are really a stimulus. They're not really important to the presentation, except to help keep you distracted from my voice. But that's okay. Thanks, Kendra.
No, that's okay. I'm hoping everyone can actually, that makes more sense. Now, there we go. Okay, go ahead. Sorry,
Yep.
Ursula.
Okay, no, that's all right. So I was saying that we'd start with just revisiting the abuse crisis within our church. And we know that, the major reports of sexual abuse by clergy and members of religious orders were documented in many countries since the 1990s and 2000s. And those allegations and investigations revealed long-term patterns of misconduct and in some cases secrecy and denial and failures by church authorities to address and disclose allegations. And of course, the Royal Commission told us, and we know this, that many, many, many victims take years to be able to disclose their abuse. And the consequences of that long delay is really significant for us all. And the results, of course, have been criminal prosecutions, civil litigation, and importantly, internal church reviews. So for us, we know, for example, that between 2001 and 2010, the Holy See reviewed roughly 3,000 cases involving priests, and some were dating back decades. But that's only what was reported. It's the tip of the iceberg in what we understand has been a global crisis. But in responding to that, sometimes people don't understand that a lot of work has been done by the church. They may not have seen the work that's been done by the church. So I just wanted to reinforce that. The church has made quite significant steps to address clerical abuse, and successive popes have issued statements and implemented reforms in response to the crisis since the 1980s particularly. So John Paul II described sexual abuse within the church as a profound contradiction of the teaching and witness of Jesus Christ. And then we have Pope Benedict, who met with victims and expressed the shame for the harm caused and criticised the failures by church leaders. And of course, we know the work that Pope Francis has done, convening a global meeting of Episcopal Conference presidents in 2019 and introducing a series of measures to increase transparency and accountability. And our new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, has urged victims to report abuse, and he's rejected any sense of secrecy around abuse, And most recently, just recently, he met with survivors and reiterated the importance of transparency and vigilance in keeping people safe. And one of the things that we need to understand, although it's very difficult for us to argue, is that Catholic clergy abuse of minors is presumed to have been at a higher rate than other adult men or clergy from other traditions. And here in Australia, the fact that so many of our early institutions were established and run by religious men and women, both in the Catholic tradition and in other faith-based organisations, including Salvation Army and the Benevolent Society, but that elevated the perception within our community that it is clergy abuse. What we really know from the work that's been done in the report of the Royal Commission and other research that's been carried on since that time is that abuse by clergy has declined significantly over time, the reporting of abuse by clergy, and that is in response to many of the mechanisms and changes that have been introduced within the church, including the work that we're doing here in Australia. But going back to where we've come from, in 2014, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child actually issued a damning report on the Holy See. That report prompted global debate and transparency within church governance, and increased pressure on the Vatican to strengthen reporting protocols and institutional safeguards. And in that report, they basically said, they asserted that cases of child sexual abuse have hardly ever been reported because of a binding code of silence imposed on all members, with the penalty of excommunication imposed. And the committee found that abusive clergy were often reassigned, that bishops were not required to report allegations to civil authorities, and that some known offenders were retaining access to children. In response to that report, the Holy See reported to the United Nations Committee Against Torture that 3,420 cases of abuse involving minors have been investigated over the previous decade, and that 884 priests had been removed from ministry. And in 2017, Pope Francis actually acknowledged that there was still a backlog of about 2,000 cases awaiting review. I haven't been able to find a later figure than this. Perhaps Father Stephen Hackett might be able to contribute a later figure, but I haven't been able to find one. And that all comes back to the criticism of the Church's processes of dealing with allegations of abuse through the dicastery that is responsible in the Vatican. Anyway, moving on from there, we just have to think about what the Church has been doing to respond. We know that there's a common misconception that the Catholic Church is a kind of unified hierarchical structure where the Pope is the ultimate arbiter of all things good and God, but unfortunately that isn't the reality. The Church's response to abuse cases has operated at congregational level, diocesan level, Episcopal Conference level, and the Vatican levels. And in the past, individual bishops and congregational superiors handled allegations independently, sometimes effectively and sometimes not so effectively. And then for much of the 20th century, there was an approach that actually took accused priests and provided a psychiatric treatment. According to the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference, earlier bishops viewed abuse as a spiritual problem requiring a spiritual solution, i.e., prayer, and a psychological issue rather than a criminal one. But in fact, that was an early 20th century model, and there is little research available on actual clergy offenders themselves or on the success of those kind of programs. But moving on, as things became much more globally reported particularly in the 2000s, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis both sought to act on the issue of clerical abuse during their pontificates. First of all, Benedict strengthened canon law provisions relating to the Vatican clergy and staff, and some of us remember when he was in Australia for World Youth Day that he apologised for abuse that had occurred in Australia. And that was a profound message at the time that was part of feeding into the establishment of the Royal Commission. In 2011, the Vatican published new guidelines mandating clergy and religious to develop clear and coordinated procedures for sexual abuse allegations by 2012. So actually implemented a requirement and a time frame for that. And those guidelines instructed bishops and religious to cooperate with the police, to respect local laws. But unfortunately, that request didn't actually mean that reporting was mandatory or that the authority of the bishops in dealing with the abuse cases was therefore retained by them. Then in March 2014, again, in response to the global surge of the crisis, Pope Francis created the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and appointed Cardinal Sean O'Malley as its head. And he said at the time that the Commission's specific task is to propose the most opportune initiatives for the protection of minors and vulnerable adults in order that we may do everything possible to ensure that crimes such as those which have occurred are no longer repeated by the Church. And the Commission is to promote local responsibility in the particular churches, uniting efforts in those congregations for the doctrine of the faith, for the protection of all children and vulnerable adults. So in that statement and in creating the Pontifical Commission, he was doing two things. He was actually acknowledging the important principles of solidarity and of subsidiarity, that the responsibility needed to be taken down to the local episcopal levels and the local churches. Then in 2018, more scandals emerged in several countries, including a report in the US where more than 300 priests were plausibly accused of abuse over decades. And Pope Francis expressed his shame at the findings and instigated a meeting on the protection of minors in the Church, bringing together all the presence of the episcopal conferences around the world to address global standards. And at that time, he said, looking ahead to the future, no effort must be spared to create a culture and to able to prevent such situations from happening, but also to prevent the possibility of their being covered up and perpetuated. The pain of the victims and their families is also our pain. And so it's urgent that we once more reaffirm our commitment to ensure the protection of minors and vulnerable adults. So at that time, the Commission began working with two global unions for men and women religious, the International Union of Superiors General Women and the Union of Superior General for Men, to explore that concept of safeguarding and the care for men and women religious in their various apostolates. And this collaboration also resulted in the publication of a manual called A Culture of Care and Protection, New Challenges for Consecrated Life. Then we moved to 2019, where Pope Francis issued the Motu Proprio, Vos Estis Lux Mundi, You Are the Light of the World, which required all clerics and members of religious institutes, including bishops, to report allegations of sexual abuse or cover-ups. And that law mandated that every diocese establish a stable reporting system and that metropolitan archbishops submit regular updates to the Holy See, with investigations to be completed within 90 days. So he then, in 2019, also released his apostolic letter Communis Vitae, which amended canon law to require the dismissal of religious members who were absent and unreachable for 12 months. And that measure was intended to address cases in which clergy disappeared or were transferred without oversight, because that was seen to have been one of the really important strategies that had been used in a veil of secrecy in the past to move people. When we had that experience expressed and investigated quite clearly during the Royal Commission in Australia. Then he also issued the instruction on the confidentiality of legal proceedings, which removed the pontifical secret from the cases involving vulnerable persons. And that document allowed the sharing of information with civil to support civil law, civil investigations. Then in 2022, he instructed the Pontifical Commission to commission a report of safeguarding measures across the globe. And in 2024, they began testing the Universal Guidelines Framework, which is a set of principles, policies, and procedures to safeguard against the occurrence of abuse in ecclesial contexts. And it aims to allow progressive verification of policies and how that's implemented across diverse cultures. So once they're finalised and they're still being tested and feedback is being provided through the Episcopal conferences and other organisations such as Caritas, Catholic Mission, those organisations that are working across the church, particularly in countries, developing countries, non-Western countries, that will help to those principles will be translated into local languages and importantly into the local cultural context so that it speaks to the local church and local society. And then all church entities will be obliged to ensure their local safeguarding guidelines reflect the general principles. So here in Australia, those principles align very closely with the National Catholic Safeguarding Standards. And here we are blessed to have a strong regulatory system. Some people say it's overreach, but in terms of where we're at, we have very clear civil guidelines around our safeguarding responsibilities. And there's a challenge for implementing the Universal Guidelines Framework in other countries where there is not underpinning legislation that supports that. So that is one of the big challenges. And in 2024, the Commission released its pilot annual report on safeguarding policies and procedures. The first report marked at the first decade of the work of the Pontifical Commission. And then in 2025, it released its second report, which had a theme of reparation, serving as both what they describe as a compass and a chronicle in the Church's global pilgrimage towards accountability. And in releasing that, they said the implementation process transcends simple procedural compliance. Rather, it brings about a conversion of the hearts. And when we talk about a safeguarding culture and embedding a safeguarding culture in Australia, there couldn't be a stronger message than to say that this is a conversion of the hearts. This is about embedding culture, safeguarding culture. Then, of course, we've had the revised Ratio Nationalis, sorry, Father Stephen, I can't get my head around that one, which is the worldwide guidance for seminaries and formation programs. So the point I'm making in all of that is that the church at both the global and local levels, just like governments and communities, has been both reactive and proactive on the issue of abuse. And that's where we were kind of lockstep with the church and with government in where things are at. So now just moving on to where we are in Australia, if that's all right. I don't know how I'm going for time now, Kendra, but here in Australia, the change has really been very evident. It's slow and variable across the country in some respects, but when the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse reported in 2017, that proved to be a pivotal moment. I want to say that not everything has been defined by the Royal Commission because there are other things that have happened that have really brought the concepts of safeguarding to the surface in more significant ways as well. So against the background of all of the work that was happening in the Vatican around Pope Francis' instructions from 2014 on, and knowing what was coming from the Royal Commission, the Catholic leadership established, first of all, Catholic Professional Standards Limited, and then this later transitioned to ACSL. And its role was to provide a framework for the Church to build safe environments. It included the development of National Catholic Safeguarding Standards, which meet both civil and church requirements for safeguarding, and providing support to victims and survivors, training and development, supporting church authorities to implement Vos Estis. And we also have the responsibility of collecting data and undertaking research. So in that respect, we're currently initiating what's called the National Safeguarding Data Project, which people may want to know more about later. But on the civil side, governments have significantly increased regulation. They established the National Office of Child Safety to oversee and deliver on the national plan, which was developed in response to the Royal Commission findings. And that plan has impact across all government portfolios. It has impacts for state and territory governments as well, and for civil society organisations. So many of you will have heard of the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study. This is a world first study of the impacts of abuse over the life trajectory. The study generated the first national Australian prevalence estimates of the 5 types of child maltreatment and their adverse impacts on health and other outcomes. It's an incredibly significant study, and it's about to enter into its second phase. But the information that was the data that's been collected and the analysis of that data over time has had international acclaim. It's generated multiple significant scientific findings that have major implications, both for the Australian government and state and territory governments, and for communities more broadly. And it's a really important piece of information that underpins the future approaches to safeguarding. Other important recommendations from the Royal Commission included child safe legislation, mandatory reporting regimes, the national standards for child safe organisations, mandatory training, reforms in data collection and sharing across portfolios and organisations, regulatory organisations, the establishment of the National Redress Scheme, a support mechanism for victims and survivors, the removal of statutes of limitations for abuse cases, and the holy grail, which is yet to be achieved, is a national working with children's check. But we're now 10 years on from the release of the draft report, and I think it's really important to consider how the social and policy environments have changed in that time and the implications for our safeguarding work. So first of all, since 2017, there have been several other important Royal Commissions and state-based inquiries that have reported. So there's been the Royal Commission into Aged Care, a Royal Commission into Veterans Care, studies into violence and family abuse, domestic and family violence. There's been the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disability. There's been an investigation into out-of-home care services across Australia, and most recently in Queensland and Victoria, there have been investigations into the childcare system, which have recommended sweeping reforms, which are starting to roll out and have implications for all of us. The recommendations are being made to improve the care and safety of children and vulnerable people. The practical outcomes of those investigations are threefold and have implications, again, for all of us. First of all, there is incredibly greater community awareness of how these systems are failing within our community, and there are huge expectations from the community for change. There's demand for change. There's, in response to that demand for change and in the findings of these reviews, there's significant changes to legislation and increased regulation. And thirdly, there is an expectation of greater transparency and accountability requirements for service providers. But we have to think about what else has happened during that time, not just those formal reviews and investigations, but think about what else has happened within our environment. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic and in its impact is far-reaching within our health, education and service systems and the economy itself. Then we have the civil unrest and the wars in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, and their impact here in Australia in terms of not only the contributions that Australia is making to respond to those efforts, but also the psychological impact that it's having on people just to be seeing and being exposed to the devastation that's happening there. We have increased reporting of elder abuse and a new aged care legislation and changes to the My Aged Care system that really put some different responsibilities onto communities that are really important for us to understand. We've all seen most recently the rise of racial intolerance and how that comes into our work in terms of supporting refugees or people from diverse communities. And of course, the growing number of people from culturally diverse communities that are within our parishes and our communities. We've seen the surge in our dependence on digital technology, and that has real challenges for us in terms of cybersecurity against fraud, scams, and online abuse. We've seen a global surge in modern slavery, in people trafficking, and in poverty, and that is something that we need to understand has implications for us in terms of our supply chains and the work that we're doing to protect people locally from modern slavery, including young people who are now in the workforce part-time, still children working in McDonald's and other places. We have significant climate change impacts, particularly in the Oceania region, where many of our ministries are operating. We have the adoption of voluntary assisted dying legislation and the implications that has for us in our service missions. And of course, we have Donald Trump, enough said there. But all of these things point to new areas of vulnerability that we need to consider in our safeguarding practices. So safeguarding is no longer just about child sexual abuse. It's about the care and protection of vulnerable people in society. So when we think about that, we think, where are we heading? And at the 10-year point of Royal Commissions, there is an accountability review of the recommendations. So we are expecting that to happen for the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. It will ask what actions have been taken and how have we improved the situation. To date, our policies in the Church have focused on establishing consistent standards to prevent abuse and to assist the Church on its journey to learn from the mistakes of the past and to ensure that children's safety and that of vulnerable people is a core part of our mission. We're also honouring and acknowledging the vulnerabilities of adults at risk in response to canon law as well as societal expectations. So it'll be easy enough to report on Catholic participation in the National Redress Scheme, for example. It's scheduled to be wound up in 2028. But there are many people in our communities who've experienced abuse and who are not eligible for the national redress scheme. So where and how are we encountering and accompanying them? And what will be in place to support reparation and healing after the national redress scheme winds up? We'll be able to report on the audits and reviews that we've undertaken. We'll provide statistics on the training that's been provided, and hopefully we'll be able to report on the decline in abuse allegations and the time taken to respond to them. But for me, there are really important questions, and I hope that they'll be important questions for you too. The first one is, how do we demonstrate culture change? How do we provide confidence to the Royal Commissioners, to the government and the community that there is greater transparency and accountability within the Church? How do we capture the impact of the work that we've all been engaged in since 2017? How do we pivot to respond to new and emerging risks? And how do we respond to the findings and the long-term implications of the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study? And most importantly, how do we include the lived experience of survivors in ways in which we are building our safeguarding capacity? Pope Leo has urged that we concentrate on hearing and listening to the voice of abuse survivors. And Father Hans Zollner, who'll be with us again next week, has emphasised that point. We need always to place those who've been abused at the centre of what we do. And the former New South Wales Children's Guardian, Steve Kinmond, reminds us that change needs to actually be initiated from within communities where the real work of safeguarding takes place. What we hear from survivors is that there's a sense that the Church is only looking after its own. We need to acknowledge this and address the pastoral role of our parishes and our Catholic services in our local communities. So how do we affirm and acknowledge the work of the many thousands of volunteers who are supporting the Church's safeguarding ministry, which is always focused on improvement and making our Church safer? They in turn need our support. Let's not take them for granted. So you can see that the future of safeguarding is now contextual, where safeguarding is all about being trauma aware and centres our efforts around the environmental and social risks that expose children and vulnerable people to harm. Last year, I spoke at the CSSA conference about the link between poverty and vulnerability to abuse, and how we need a national safeguarding framework that captures the key principles of safety, respect, dignity, and personal agency across all parts of our society. Because we know safeguarding can be hard and daunting work, keeping people accountable for actions isn't always fun. Safeguarding is ongoing. Abusers are opportunistic and manipulative and target the vulnerable. However, we in the church have a special responsibility. So I want to just finish here with this. This is a quote from Archbishop Verney, who is the new head of the Pontifical Commission. He, in reporting the second report of the Pontifical Commission, he said, "Our mission requires us to embody the gospel through concrete action by prioritising faith, charity, and justice in each safeguarding initiative, by fostering peace and the common good through transparent church structures, and by ensuring that the prophetic voice of survivors remains central to our collective conversion." So whether we are a faith-based organisation or whether we're working in the civil space, as civil society organisations, we have those key things to consider: justice, peace, and the common good, transparency, and hearing the voice of survivors. That's the really important message and the future of safeguarding for us all. So thank you, Kendra. That ends my presentation, and I'm happy to open it up for conversation now.
Thank you so much, Ursula. For everyone in the background, I had a few problems with my technology earlier, so that's why we didn't have the slides. I will include them in the link in the email that I send at the end. I've also, from your speech and your conversation, Ursula, I will include links to the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. I'll include links to the Voices of Survivor YouTube performance, and I'll include links to Father Hans's live stream next week. So the recording will come out within the next couple of days. But what we'd like to do is open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, anyone has any comments that they want to add to what Ursula has said, please feel free to speak up and say something, or to write something in the chat and say that you'd like to say something. But certainly, I'm sitting here, Ursula, listening to all of that, having heard it all before, but also taking it all in and taking different parts in each minute. And your final comment about, and I'm going to ask you to repeat those three things: the charity, sorry.
No, you really caught me off
It
guard.
went in and it went out again. But we're just repeating those three things we need to keep in mind with safeguarding.
Well, it's actually very important, because those three things are charity, justice, peace, and the common good, and ensuring the voice of survivors.
Charity, justice, peace, common good, and survivors. Is that right? Voice. Thank you. Because what I was thinking is that I should also include that in the email as a summary for people.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
So okay. Did anyone else want to say something, put in something in the chat? Anita's asked, the link to the document published about consecrated light. Absolutely. That was started with a culture of care, I think Ursula called it.
Yeah. While we're waiting for some questions, I have a question of Father Stephen. As the former General Secretary of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, perhaps, Father Stephen, you could tell us, if you wouldn't mind, if you could reflect on how you see the challenges for clergy are in this space, given that sense that when we are dealing with our religious congregations, we often feel that for the women, there is a sense that this was not within the women religious congregations. And for many of the religious men, it's a case of a sense of shame of having this having happened within their own congregation. So this might be something that you could reflect from your experience as both the General Secretary, but also as a provincial of your congregation.
Thank you, Ursula. Love you too. Look, in my former role, and especially watching, the church leaders' participation in the Royal Commission, some of those live streamed sessions. There was a lot to learn, but we didn't cover ourselves in glory always. And some confusion and disappointment flowed from that. I suspect in many ways at the time, and we're going back to 2016, 17, as the Royal Commission extended, but then came to conclusion. I think very few people who are in church leadership roles, lay vowed or ordained, had adequate background really to address what was going on. We knew the tragedy and the trauma that had followed from abuse. And in many cases, I think for many dioceses and religious institutes of men, while a few had multiple offenders, many just had a couple of offenders. And if you took them out of the mix, it reduced, the abuse had reduced by 90%, and it looked very different. But I suspect many clergy and religious haven't handled this at all. We know there's a need for cultural change. I'm convinced that's about quite profound conversion. It's not just the externals of how we think and act, but it's how we even engage. Like in my own province, we did an exercise on a naming policy for buildings and awards and that sort of thing, and we landed on 70 years. Now, we have buildings all over the province, some named for men who are still living, but we didn't want to put a victim in a situation where a building might be named for someone, even if there was even the slightest possibility. And you never quite know until someone comes forward. And someone came forward and said, I was abused 67 years ago by this man who's been dead for 50 years. But the pushback from people who didn't understand why we'd say, well, we've got other names we can use. Why do we have to honour? It's not about us anyway. It's about Christ and his church. Why do we have to honour these men who may have been great builders or great leaders or whatever? But just the response to saying our naming policy is 70 years after they've died before they will put their name to a building or an award. Many didn't understand it. And that comes from not having grasped how long it can take for people who have been abused to come forward. And then I'd have concerns that there are confreres who are themselves victims, and there'd be priests in dioceses who are victims. We saw one of the most profound examples of it during the first session of the plenary council 5 years ago. And how we even begin to respond to them. And again, it's cultural change at a profoundly deep level, not cultural change in terms of having safeguarding standards and regulation and procedures and so forth. And to the extent that I quite accept that it was always inadequate to address this as a spiritual or a moral failure, because it often was criminal and that it's caused lifelong harm for some people. Equally, I think part of our addressing it does need to be spiritual and moral, because if we don't get those in place, we don't recognise it. going back to those earlier decades where we listened to Indigenous voices, I'm talking the 1980s, we did listen to Indigenous voices, and it significantly shifted the way in which we respond and engage. And that comes from a congregation that had been working for 100 years with Aboriginal people in the top end of the country. It's harder to do that with victims, probably, than with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. But I've never sat in a room with a group of people listening to victims. I've only ever met to offer an apology with maybe one other bishop or someone present. So I think, the touchstone of conversion is hearing people's stories, I think. Pope Leo's done it, Pope Francis did it. And for Pope Francis, there's extraordinary witness to his own conversion. I think to help us get it, you've almost got to meet with people. And I've pushed back when, people have, my confreres have spoken about the inconvenience of having to get permission to minister when you cross a diocesan boundary, and it's a 5-minute admin exercise. We've got a long way to go, I think. I really think it would be very helpful if it was possible to provide safeguarding training in Australia. I don't mean the sort of work you're doing now, but like the qualification, the diploma or the licentiate that Gregorian University offers. There's a micro credential course at the University of St. Paul in Ottawa. There's a course at the, I think the Ateneo St. Thomas in Manila. Like, we need to keep getting our own members trained, so that because then you've got people who are aware, and when they hear comments that indicate that people haven't actually really shifted at all in what they think, because they're unaware and they haven't had the encounter. I think that's again where Pope Francis was so right. He talked about it's the encounter with people that actually helps us shift. But if we did have a diploma or something in Australia, I think that'd make a big difference. I'd send someone every year to do it for 3 months or 6 months or something. And it may well be that I'm sorry, I've gone off what you asked me to talk about. It may well be that it'd be better offered under a competency-based thing like a TAFE would do, rather than a university. Anyway, it's a thought. I think we've got a long way to go.
Well, Father Stephen, it's a very good thought, and it's a project that we are currently working on. So
that's true. I'm not surprised. Yeah.
I hope that's helpful. But thank you for your comments, and thank you for your reflection, because you were there living through and participating in that whole Royal Commission. So you have a particular perspective. So just in terms now, if you don't mind, we'll move on to some of these other questions now, Kendra. Gabriel has just asked me about the data initiative. So we have developed one of the things that is in the mandate of ACSL is to undertake data and research. We don't have a huge capacity for analytical research, but we do have some capacity for data collection. And one of the initiatives that we've undertaken is to develop in the first instance, we had to stabilize and contain the national database that was part of Towards Healing files in perpetuity. And we've used the template and the framework of that database to create a contemporary complaint management system and database. And we're trialling that with several organisations across the church in February and March this year, and we will make that available. But we have asked professional standards officers to provide us with a preliminary data that we will be able to collect and report in 2026. So Gabriel, we have a paper that's been prepared and has been provided to CRA and to AMPJP and to the Bishops' Commission for Professional Standards, outlining the strategy. We can provide that to people more generally if they would like it. it's certainly an important initiative. What we have is international interest in kind of comparing what's happened across the whole church. So the USA, Scotland, Ireland, England report on allegations, the use of the standards, all kinds of things. We don't have that data capacity in Australia, and it's a big missing piece of the puzzle in actually being able to look globally at the research that's going on. So it's an important piece of work for us here in Australia to get that underway.
And Ursula, thank you. The next question is from Kelly, that you mentioned real work of safeguarding happens in our local communities. She's interested to know if it's a lived statement in particular parishes, and is there any stats around how this is taking place?
Again, that's a challenge about data, but I think that in the first instance, what you have, we just have to remember that we don't live in this little vacuum. We live in our communities, and I'm just reflecting on my own community here as an example that we have people in our community with lived experience of abuse who are not participating in the church, but were experienced that abuse when they were at school, and they carry that's a huge burden that they carry. And I know that people will have heard of this kind of sense of survivor guilt for those people who were in the school with these schoolmates and are still friends with them, but not only were they weren't aware of the abuse, and they weren't abused themselves, so they have this sense of why not me or why them. So there is, as well as the regulation that's being rolled out in terms of safety plans for people who are on the sex offenders register or other things that are happening in our communities, we have to find ways that we not necessarily connect with those systems, but that we are acutely aware of that the vulnerability of people in our community, and that's very often people in our church have come for some spiritual healing as the way of coping with what might have happened to them. And we may not be aware of that in terms of the way in which we use language, or, even things like the sign of peace and other things where we make contact with people that we don't know. There are just lots of practices within our church that we can be much more sensitive and trauma aware about. They're the kinds of things that we're kind of helping parishes to be more mindful of, and we do that through our learning platform, the kinds of work that Kendra's been doing in actually bringing those issues to the surface, so that parishes and communities can kind of percolate and think about how they work in their own environments.
Ursula, can I add to that as well? Simply based on my experience of being in audits, particularly in parishes where there is a volunteer safeguarding coordinator, there are no stats about this, but my entire reaction has been about a third of those volunteer safeguarding coordinators have been abused at some point in the past. And they have provided that information in confidence after the audit one-on-one. But it has ended up being I was sitting there thinking about it yesterday based on another conversation I had, and tallying it up and thinking it has been about a third of those volunteer safeguarding coordinators in parishes. And so they are turning their horrid experiences and their trauma into helping their parishes, which is fantastic and so amazing of them. Yeah. The next question was from Janine to Stephen. So I'm glad you haven't muted Stephen. If you've got 2 seconds, can you say a little bit more about what the culture change is about? What are we changing to rather than changing from?
Okay, and I was just typing a response to that in the chat, Kendra. So I'll delete
I'm glad
all
I
of
got
that.
on top of it.
Look, it's what I refer to, I think, as what can flow from encounter, and I use the word conversion, and at the risk of sounding a bit academic, by that I'd mean what Bernard Lonergan says, that conversion is a transcending of the horizons of our consciousness. We come to see and understand and think differently. We're fundamentally changed, and we don't see things and understand things the way we used to. And look, my own limited experience is that does come about from the encounter with people who have been abused. It prompts us, once you've moved, once that shift has happened to that, then you reflect back on your own dealings with people in the past and see where you perhaps didn't deal with them in whatever manner. I'm not talking about abuse, but that wasn't the way in which you'd have preferred to deal with them if you'd understood more what their journey or their life had been about. For me personally, one of the biggest reckonings has been to realize that you never ever know what someone's story is until they tell you. And that fundamentally changes how you relate with anyone in a pastoral situation, not just survivors and victims or people who you suspect might have, abuse as part of their story, but just to recognize, whether it's in the workplace or at meetings or whatever, you never quite know what someone's story sitting at the table with you is until they choose to disclose that story. And they may never, most won't. But it does shift, the quality of engagement or encounter or something. So in terms then of changing to rather than from, well, we know what the from has been. I think the to is the ongoing work, accepting that we keep on growing and learning through conversion. And in time, that hopefully makes us better disciples of Jesus and better witnesses to the gospel and more adept, whatever our own limitations are, at responding to people as we meet them rather than according to some preconceived idea of what that ought to be. And listening is a big part of that, no question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Father Stephen. Ursula, I've put you back on the spotlight for a second because it is 2:00 and we are ending. I'm putting you back because I want to say thank you. There's some thanks in the chat box, but overall, thank you very much for leading our first webinar this year and talking about the future and where we're heading. What I'm hoping then is that we spend the year actually moving forward and improving, like Father Stephen just said. And then towards the end of the year, we have the review of the Royal Commission, 10 years on. So we've got a big program ahead for our webinars this year. Keep checking our newsletter, checking the learning management system, checking our website, keeping an eye on what you want to come to. We're very, very happy to have you. I will be sending all of this stuff out as email, some today with the links and then some next week with the link to the recording. But Ursula, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Kendra, for the opportunity to update everyone. Can I just say before we close, we have managed to organise to live stream Father Hands next week. So that's an important new update next Wednesday. And so I've asked Kendra to provide that link if you're able to. You can't join us in person in Melbourne, but you can join us online, particularly for his session. That whole thing, that is about the theology of safeguarding, which is I think is where Father Stephen was leading us. So thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you everyone for your time today, and go well, go safe, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.